feel free to start talking whenever you want. It is recording.
Do you hear me? It's recording, so just start talking when you're ready.
And the bargain at Yalta, referred to in the last EAB Films, was that to ensure the free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, we get Stalin's promise to make sure that would happen. We get in return his promise to attack Japan within 6 months of the defeat of Adolf Hitler. That Yalta bargain was seen by subsequent conservatives in America as the Yalta betrayal. Especially when we later learn that the major advisor to Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta was an individual named Alger Hiss, who was seen to be in the late 1940s as a communist spy, later discovered in the 1990s as an actual communist agent working within the State Department. So the importance of Yalta is that from that point on, if you look at the Soviet Union, they never, ever, ever allow a free and fair election in Eastern Europe. Within a year, there will be an iron curtain that descends upon Europe, splitting it into free and Soviet blocs. The final conference is Potsdam, and this is July into August of 1945, and this is to settle the peace. Tehran, how do we fight the war? Yalta, how do we end the war? Potsdam, outside of Germany, Sanssouci, all that great German history, is to settle the peace, especially the issue of Germany, which we'll get to in a second. Potsdam, we have different characters. The British, for some unknown reason, have removed Winston Churchill as their leader and put in Clement Attlee. And Clement Attlee is the leader of Britain, and he's not Winston Churchill. Stalin is still there, but of course Franklin Roosevelt has passed away, utterly devastating the United States of America, and is replaced by Harry Truman. If you look at Franklin Roosevelt as charming and sophisticated and nuanced in his ability to deal with Joe Stalin, Harry Truman is as blunt, straightforward, and middle American as you possibly can be. And so Potsdam does not succeed. Right smack dab in the middle of it, right when we're negotiating with the Soviets to get what we want as far as Germany, Truman learns of the atomic bomb. And at that point in time, no holds are barred, because he simply goes after Stalin. He's saying, Stalin, you are not following through on your promises. You are not a man to be trusted. In fact, Molotov, the foreign minister for the Soviet Union, says, you can't treat us this way, President Truman. That's not the way you tell the truth and I'll treat you properly. Harry Truman jets back at Molotov and Stalin there. It is a confrontational conference. It does not work, and it does not solve the problem of the issue of Germany. And thus, at that point in time, you can look at all three conferences and say, hey, Soviet mistrust about Tehran at Second Front, the Yalta betrayal or bargain, and then Truman's behavior at Potsdam, all as causes of the Cold War. Now, I think maybe the ultimate issue might be Germany, and how Germany is going to be opened up, dealt with at the end of the war. Since Potsdam did not take care of it, it becomes the issue of the Cold War. Germany is occupied by the four Allied powers, and East Germany is occupied by the Soviet Union. England, France, and the United States occupy the western part of it. As 45 drags on to 46, into 47, we simply do not find a vehicle, Potsdam doesn't work, in dealing with how Germany should be. The Soviet Union very clearly has interests, and their interest is to maintain Eastern Europe as a buffer zone, as an essential wasteland, as an agricultural belt between Western Europe, from which it has been invaded twice, and the Soviet Union. And thus, they do not want to develop Germany along the lines that other countries in the West have been. The idea, and what they actually did, was rip every single piece of machinery out of Eastern Europe and ship it to the Soviet Union to use it there. The vengeance wreaked upon Germany is strong and powerful. And thus, that's what they want to do with all of Germany. Of course, the Allies want good, prosperous burghers buying American products and sending good items to America, and thus want a whole different thing. So that the division between West and East over those 2 and 3 years becomes solidified. And the border becomes represented by that which Winston Churchill put forward in 1946 after he's out of power. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended upon Europe. The East Bloc, the West Bloc, is reflected in Germany. We can't resolve it, therefore border, therefore boundary, therefore you can't go back and forth across. Now what's unique and interesting about Germany is that Berlin, the capital, which we occupy it the same way, 4 different zones, is smack dab in the middle of the East Bloc. And so what you have is an isolated capital of all the Allies, divided up into 4. Way in the middle, bad drawing, but we can do the drawing, way in the middle of the East Bloc. So Berlin's there. Germany is divided. West Germany, which becomes the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, which becomes the Deutsche Democratic Republic or the German Democratic Republic. West, East, Iron Curtain. Well, Berlin is itself divided in half, and so Berlin becomes the outpost of civilization of the West in the East Bloc. And by 46, you have rail going across and that you can travel on, and you have road going across that you can travel on. Those, indeed, are the routes to the West from West Berlin. And in Berlin itself, Checkpoint Charlie, amongst other places, it is divided in half. And so we don't resolve the issue. 2 countries get formed, and Berlin itself gets split in half. Of course, if you're Joe Stalin in the Soviet Union, you don't like the fact that there's an outpost of Western civilization. Beautiful, gorgeous, wonderful, money-filled, prosperous West Berlin sitting in your capital. So in 1947, the event, potentially, of the Cold War's origins is the Berlin blockade. And Joe Stalin says Berlin's ours, it's in our part of East Germany, it's our capital, it is communist. And blockades the roads, and blockades the railroads, and isolates West Berlin and says, give it up. Of course, Harry Truman says, no, I'm the straightforward middle American guy that I am, we won't give it up. And we have the Berlin airlift from 47 into 48, where we heroically for 9 months fly supplies into West Berlin, refusing to let it fall to the Soviets, keeping it as an outpost of Western civilization, an outpost of good, democratic, liberal, capitalist values there in the East. Now, as the Iron Curtain descends from 49 on, as life in the East Bloc, all of those countries in the East Bloc becomes increasingly desperate over the course of the 50s. What you have is an exodus out. Of course, your country, be it Czechoslovakia, be it Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Lithuania, they won't let you out. Is there any way to get out of the East Bloc? Doctors, lawyers, intelligent business people, is there any way out of there? There's one way. And the one way out is through East Berlin. You can get a travel visa to East Germany. You can get a travel visa to East Berlin. And at that point in time, in the late 1950s, you hop on the subway, you get on the subway, go to West Berlin, and then you're free. And so at that point in time, it's this amazing exodus of people from the East Bloc going to the West Bloc via Berlin. Of course, the new premier, Khrushchev, says, of the Soviet Union, says this is intolerable and says Berlin is ours, get out. And in 1961, what you have is John F. Kennedy, a new and different Democratic president in the United States, saying, no, we're not giving it up. It's ours. We're going to maintain it as a bastion of freedom and liberty. We'll pay any price, bear any burden, suffer any cost in order to defend liberty around the world. So John F. Kennedy, in fact, goes to Berlin, stands there in front of the West Berlin people, pledges his support for the maintenance of this outpost of civilization, gives a big long speech, and then in order to identify himself with the people of Berlin, in order to identify himself as one of them, says in German, Ich bin ein Berliner. And he says, you know, I am one of you. Ich is I, bin is am, ein is a, and then Berliner is a jelly donut. So he literally proclaims, I am a jelly donut in German to the German people, not realizing that's the improper translation. He should have said, he come aus Berlin, he should put any number of other things. But the German people don't care, because the President of the United States, young, charismatic, is pledging his assistance to them to maintain them as free and independent of communist rule. Historic speech. What happens within months is Khrushchev, as the Soviet premier, says, no, and builds a wall. In 1961, bam, right smack down the middle of Berlin, separating the two. And at that point in time, this outpost becomes totally isolated and sits there and is on its own, and you have to and cannot cross from east into west at all. Hundreds of people die trying to go from east into west, escape routes of increasing ingenuity. But by the time I was a young college student in 1980, there in Berlin, you could be in West Berlin, study in West Berlin, go up to the wall that overnight was created, go up on a little platform and look at a no man's land of 20 to 100 yards between you and the east with barbed wire, roving guard dogs, and machine gun turrets to stop people from going from west to east. Thus, Germany and Berlin within Germany is one of the major causes of the Cold War. The idea of U.S. foreign policy thus shifts. In 1947, 1948, Harry Truman, the president, having been reelected in 1948, will pursue a new policy. And his policy is put forward by an individual named George Kennan. And George Kennan articulates the containment doctrine. And the containment doctrine can be seen as a cause of the Cold War because it's the United States response to the Yalta betrayal. It's the United States response to the Berlin airlift and blockade. And it's a whole new foreign policy where Truman says, we will in fact contain communism wherever it is on the globe. And there are two aspects to this containment policy. Number one is that in Greece and Turkey, you know, the southeastern end of Europe, there is Soviet unrest. There is the potential of those countries going communist. And so what Truman says, under the containment doctrine, which is C, containment doctrine, you have two parts. And one is the Truman doctrine. And the Truman doctrine is that which says we will send money and weapons to stop communism around the globe. And we pledge $400 million immediately right then and there to Greece and Turkey to stop communism. And that's an historic step for the United States. The isolation neutrality of the years past, now our president says we're going to put troops on the ground, we're going to put money on the ground, we're going to put weapons on the ground to stop communism all around the world. Truman Doctrine. 1948 also sees the second aspect of the containment doctrine, and that is the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is this brilliant, wonderful, altruistic idea that we will give money to Western Europe. And we do. We give $12 billion to Western Europe so that they can rebuild themselves after World War II. So by the end of 47 into 48, we're starting to ship money to Europe. They have that money. They will now use it to rebuild themselves. An incredibly idealistic thing. We did the same thing in Japan, much less money, but $3 billion. And it's ironic that as victors, we could have destroyed Japan and destroyed Germany. But the United States, after World War II, chose to spend money to rebuild those societies. Ironic that it wasn't too much later, by 1980, that those industries, those economies that we rebuilt actually came back to whoop us a little bit. By 1980, would you buy a Ford or a Mercedes? Would you buy a Dodge or a Toyota? And the success of the Japanese economic recovery in the Marshall Plan was evident, that we rebuilt them. The Marshall Plan was incredibly altruistic, but incredibly practical, in that if the people of Western Europe have US dollars in hand, they buy US products. And so we now are seeking to contain communism all around the world